Imagine a home with no ground under your feet, where the nearest earth might be a trembling mat of reeds, a ledge carved into a cliff, or a column of basalt that drops away into blue air. Picture a life arranged around balance, of stones stacked against a slope, of totora bundles lashed and layered to keep an island afloat, of ropes and nets holding a doorway to the world. This is not daredevil showmanship. It is daily work, prayer, and stubborn choice, the architecture of identity. Today, we travel to 5 places that refuse the ordinary flatness of habitation and redefine what it means to be settled. Reed islands patched on a high Andean lake, terraces clinging to a valley where the road is a rumour, a sparse, stony high desert where wind is a constant tenant, churches hewn down into living rock, and monasteries sitting like crowns atop pillars of stone. Some of these peoples live close to 4,000 meters above sea level. Others are suspended in other ways, by devotion, by defense, by centuries of careful maintenance. Each chapter is a study in how communities transform scarcity into survival, rigor into ritual, and vulnerability into durable meaning. Editor note: verify spelling of local names, Kalaka versus Kalash, Drogba, and confirm altitudes and any historical dates before finalizing narration. If this journey calls to you, if you want to keep discovering how people make impossible places into home, consider subscribing to follow the next chapters of this story. Chapter 1. Uros, Lake Titicaca, Islands that Breathe. The reeds creak before you see the island. Totora rolls and sighs underfoot like a living deck, and every step answers with a soft, uncertain spring. The air is thin enough to make speech feel deliberate. The cold water smells clean and metallic, and the lake breathes in wide, slow waves that make the reed edges bob, as if the islands are afloat on the back of some sleeping animal. These are the Uros, a people who live on floating islands of Totora on Lake Titicaca. The lake's altitude is high, roughly 3,112 meters above sea level. That thinness matters. At that height, water tastes different, wood snaps differently, and human work is measured in breaths. The islands themselves are bundles of reeds tied into mats, layered and anchored until a village becomes a patchwork of buoyant platforms. From a distance, the settlements look delicate, like rafts tethered to the shallow shore, but the illusion of fragility is misleading. The engineering is precise and insistently maintained. To keep an island alive, Totora must be replaced constantly. The community's maintenance schedule is a kind of calendar. New reeds seeded along the island's undersides, dead layers cut away, fresh bundles lashed on top. Men and women work in teams, hauling slim, wet rods across the reed surface, sometimes bending low to weave, sometimes wading into shallows to secure ropes. The smell of wet totora is green and lemon-tinged. It rises beneath clothes dampened by morning fog. Islanders estimate how many bundles will be needed each month by eye and memory. Too few and the island sinks a little, falters, and recruits must work twice as hard the following week. Weekly maintenance is not ritual for its own sake. It is survival in motion. The island breathes and the people keep pace. Food on the islands is built from what the lake offers and what the high plains allow. Fish are central, cut into fillets, sun-dried along reed walls, grilled over small hearths that fill the tiny huts with smoke. Totora itself offers more than flotation. Its pith is edible, used in small preparations, and its fibers find their way into mats and roofs. Clothing is a practical cathedral of wool. Layered alpaca and llama garments that trap minute pockets of air against the skin, shielding from a sun that can be bright enough to burn, while the wind simultaneously slices with cold. Hands are tough, faces are wind-carved. Children learn to step in rhythm to the island's movement from their first unsteady walks. History here is a geography of choice and defense. Oral memory holds that some Uros' ancestors retreated from the nearby shores to escape political and military pressure that sometimes arrived from powerful neighbors, other times from colonial incursions. Floating away from shore was an adaptation that became identity. Living on water carved away to resist assimilation. The lake itself became a border and a home rolled into one. Rituals honor that fact. Offerings to Kotamama, the mother of the lake, are woven into daily practice. Small tokens are set into the water, prayers are murmured like sutures, religion and maintenance are braided together. A repaired island is an answered prayer, and a failed seam is a call to new vows. Tourism complicates the picture. Visitors come eager for the image of reed boats and smiling, costumed hosts. That image brings income and danger in the same breath. Income buys diesel for small motors, medicine and school supplies. It also brings pollution, plastic that flutters into the reeds and oils that stain the water. The scale of visits changes social rhythms. Performances are scheduled, crafts are commodified, and the island's calendar becomes partly market-driven. Youth face choices that their parents rarely faced. A steady wage in the city, education, and a life unbound by reed maintenance. Some leave, and the islands, built on continuity, begin to feel the absence of those hands that once wove them together. Yet there are everyday resistances too. Islanders teach children the maintenance craft as play. They hide small techniques in lullabies and jokes. Local leaders broker the relationship with tour operators carefully, trying to keep agency in local hands. They negotiate entrance spots, regulate the number of motorboats, and insist on rules that limit how their spiritual sites are treated. The lake remains both livelihood and liturgy, a surface where identity is renewed as often as reeds must be. Editor note: confirm the precise altitude for Lake Titicaca and local names of shrine practices before publication. Chapter 2. Bumbare Valley. Kalacha, terraces at the edge. The road arrives like a rumor. 1 minute there is cultivated slope and stone retaining wall. The next, a truck is inching on a hairline of earth with nothing but sky and drop on the outer edge. Dust collects in the hollows. Tires bite the loose gravel and then ease away as the driver's hands read the lane as if it were a script written on rock. The valley below seems to fall away forever in a green blur of terrace and cedar, while across the slopes the houses clamp to ledges carved into the mountain. This is the world of the people referred to in the record as Kalacha, living in the thin ribbon of valley where terraces are everything. Homes here are built from stone and timber, their foundations descended into a slope with buttresses of dry stacked rock. Roofs are low and heavy, thick timbers covered in sod, or corrugated metal that anchors roofs against wind. The interiors are small and smoky, cook fires are central, and the smoke darkens rafters into a comforting dimness, a sign of a settled life. The smell is peat and wood, mingled with the ever-present tang of livestock. Terraced fields are the lifeblood. Each strip of earth is an engineered plain, held by a wall of stones laid by hands that measure centuries by the roundness of rocks. Crops, barley, millet, small pulses grow on these narrow stairs that reset an angle of sunlight and water into plantable surfaces. When the snow comes, it erases the road. For months, avalanches and winter snows can cut these villages off, transforming supply lines into memories and making every household stores a careful ledger of risk. People plan for winters like sailors plan for storms, fodder cached, seed stored, and families gathered in the warmest room for the longest hours. Isolation shapes social life in ways the modern mind finds hard to imagine. A misstep on an access path is not only a personal injury, it can mean weeks without professional care. That possibility folds community obligations into daily routines. Neighbors are duty-bound to check, to carry, to share. Ritual life is dense and localized. In some villages, animist practices persist, woven into an overlay of major religion. Small gestures to the mountain spirits before planting, smoke offerings at watershed sites, songs that invoke the power of stone and weather. These practices are not curiosities to be catalogued. They are operational knowledge, how to ask the terrain for mercy, how to remind a slope that it is planted, not abandoned. Political marginalization is a structural pressure that never leaves the scene. In some areas, religious minorities and hill communities face pressure from state actors, religious movements, or economic neglect. Roads may be promised, then delayed. Electricity lines may skirt a valley for years without crossing into its hamlets. Climate change amplifies pre-existing threats. Glacial melt alters irrigation, changing patterns of water once taken for granted. Warmer winters can bring new pests to high terraces, while intense rains can collapse centuries of dry stone engineering in a single season. Youth weigh the lure of the valley against the promise of cities, education, steady income, and the possibility of moving where danger is not so immediate. Those who stay inherit a heavier set of tasks. Those who leave unravel specific threads of knowledge tied to place. But the people here are not mere subjects of hardship. There is craft in their adjustments. Paths are reinforced by lithe, living fences of willow. Small stone chutes channel excess water into underground cisterns. Seasonal shepherding cycles are tuned to microclimates. No map captures. When the road returns in spring, it brings taxis, newsprint, and sometimes wages for casual labor. That same road brings the specter of change. Contract workers who plant different crops. Developers who eye unclipped slopes. Missionaries who promise modernity in languages not native to the valley. The terraces, however, remain an anthology of repetition and repair. Every wall a sentence in a long-running conversation with erosion. Editor note: verify ethnonym and specific valley location, confirm descriptions about seasonal isolation, and any named rituals before final edit. Chapter 3. High-altitude desert valley, Drokpa, Lada, wind, stone, and the economy of scarcity. Beyond the green terraces and reed islands lies a different highness, an austere plain, cut by dry gullies and stony ridges, a place where the sky seems to sit closer to the body, and light spills hard and white across the ground. This valley, referenced in sources as Drokpa or Lada, spelling pending verification, reads like a lunar landscape. Scrub tussles, grit-burnished rock, and shepherds hunched against a wind that never quite lets a coat be dry. Survival here is a continual economy of available resources. Livestock, yak in some pockets, hardy sheep and local breeds of goat in others are the principal wealth. Barley and a coarse meal called taizampa are staples. Where wood is scarce, dung becomes fuel, packed into cakes, dried and stacked like a second harvest. Houses are compact and wind-sheltered, thick-walled to hold warmth. Clothing is layered. Broad shawls and felt caps, every garment chosen for its ability to trap the smallest pocket of heat. Hands are expert in handling weather, rather than the sugar and salt of market goods. Water is rationed in ways that become ritual. Terraces and small irrigation furrows pull trace amounts of glacier melt into plots that would otherwise be barren. The ingenuity is in the details: small stone-lined channels, tiny check dams, the sharing of meltwater schedules by neighborhood, a push of stones and the water shifts course for a season, a family, a field. Such engineering is by necessity communal and cooperative. This is not a landscape people own, in the sense of private plots, but maintain in overlapping rights and duties. Stories of origin circulate here as patterns in conversation. Oral histories sometimes claim distinct ancestries, and elders recite genealogies that separate their people from neighboring groups. These local narratives are vital social glue. They explain why certain practices persist and why other influences were never absorbed. They should not be read as hard science. Where claims about genetics or ancient migration arise, they are best framed as locally significant belief unless verified by independent research. The point is not lineage as fact, but lineage as meaning. The story gives a community reason to endure, a narrative that makes the choice to remain comprehensible. Pressures are heavy and multifaceted. Military roads and infrastructure projects can slice through the remoteness, bringing both danger and opportunity. A newly paved route can mean easier access to markets for a surplus of wool. It can also invite outside forces, resource extraction, new land claims, and shifts in the balance of authority. Climate trends are equally disruptive: reduced snowfall, changing timing of meltwater, and more erratic storms unhinge systems tuned over long timescales. Young people increasingly see migration as escape from scarcity. When they go, they take not only labor but knowledge, the specific ways to build a check dam, the precise timing of sowing in a microclimate, and the valley's resilience erodes in small increments. Still, resilience here is stubborn. Community festivals punctuate the calendar with shared meals and ritual songs that set the year's tone. Communal labor, known locally by words that capture both obligation and kinship, gathers neighbors to rebuild a terrace or to reline an irrigation channel. Tools are shared and adapted. Ropes made from local hair harness are used to pull loads across steep gullies. Sledges in winter carry fodder across crusted snow. The material culture is lean, efficient, and highly adapted to scarcity, an ethic of refusal to waste a resource or a hand's time. We stand now at a hinge. We have moved through water and terraces and wind-swept stone, seen the patterns that let people live where logic might say survival is impossible. Each place keeps its own rules, its own rituals. Each relies on a mix of technology, always humble and locally improvised, and on social fabrics that bind kin and neighbor into systems larger than any one household. Editor note: verify local terminology for communal labor and names of staple foods like tizampa or similar regional dishes. Confirm the presence of yaks versus other local livestock where referenced. Higher, harder places still await. The next chapters turn from living surfaces to carved space, where architecture itself is devotion. Churches cut downward into living rock, and monasteries perched on pillars that sever a community from the world below. Those sites shift the emphasis from survival by skill to survival by choice, where faith and defense intertwine, and where the very rock becomes scripture. We move next to a region where people did not merely cling to place. They carved a new cosmos into the mountain's heart, and later to another where monks chose literal suspension, hoisted in nets and baskets to preserve a way of life. But before we climb those cliffs and step into caverns of lamplight and chant, consider this. What does maintenance look like when the ground beneath you is an active participant in your fate? For the Euros, it is weekly labor with reeds. For the terrace builders, it is a season-long pledge of stone and seed. For the high desert households, it is the communal choreography of water and fodder. In each case, the question of staying is a daily negotiation with matter itself, soil, reed, rock, and with the people who know how to speak to it. Editor note: verify exact number of rock-hewn churches at Lalibela, commonly cited as 11, and historical references to meteora ascent methods, nets and winches, before final recording. We pause here on the lip of the cliff, where sound changes. Below, valleys keep their slow economies. Above, a vertical architecture waits, churches carved into the living mountain, and monasteries that turn solitude into a sanctuary. The first chisel strokes at Lalibela and the old nets of Meteora will demand a different language, one of devotion turned into craft, of stone shaped by faith, of suspension chosen as resistance. The story of those places will test the theme we are following: home as choice, as defense, as continuity against pressure. Which would you choose, the constant embodied labor of reeds and terraces, or a home made by cutting into the rock and refusing the world? Which of these survivals defines you, the day-to-day repair that keeps a roof over your head, or the grand refusal that carves a chapel into a mountain so that you are harder to reach? The answers are not theoretical. They are written in smoke-dark rafters, in the sonorous hollow of carved rock, in the slow return of fishermen to their Tortora islands. Now we prepare to descend into the rock and to climb up into the vertiginous monasteries. The next images will be darker. Chisel dust instead of reed fibers, lamplight instead of open sky, and the stakes will shift from the immediate technicalities of survival to the symbolic cost of seclusion. The way people choose to suspend themselves tells us as much about identity as it does about geography. The story of those places will test the theme we are following: home as choice, as defense, as continuity against pressure. The next images are darker. Chisel dust instead of reed fibers, lamplight instead of open sky, and the stakes shift from tools of survival to tools of devotion. In the red twilight of volcanic stone, people carved sanctuaries that inverted the usual order. Instead of building upward from earth, they tunneled down until a church hung in a hollow, a roofless cave shaped by human will. In another landscape, monks chose suspension itself, hoisted between sky and ground, to keep the world at arm's length. We begin where stone becomes scripture. Chapter 4. Lalibela, Ethiopia. The city carved downward. Imagine a hand-held chisel striking rock in steady rhythm, the sound small and endless, a metronome of faith. Picture dust that smells faintly of iron and ash, lit by the thin, wavering light of oil lamps. In Lalibela, the stone takes on voice, cut, hollowed, polished, an architecture that speaks of prayer as labor. From above the town, the churches look like geometric wounds in the earth. Squared sanctuaries whose negative space forms courtyards, stairways and tunnels. They are not raised, they are removed. What remains is a church carved out of the mountain itself. These are the rock-hewn churches attributed to King Lalibela, 11 main structures traditionally counted as a single complex carved into volcanic tuff. The impression on approach is immediate. The uphill slope yields to a small canyon of carved space, and then to doorways cut flush into stone, portals that open into cavernous interiors, where acoustics turn a whisper into a sustained note. The air inside is cooler and charged with incense, lamplight pools on stone floors, worn by centuries of pilgrimage. The construction is astonishing in scale and method. Craftspeople began at the top and worked downward, a subtraction rather than an addition. Imagine teams laying out the skyward outline and removing tons of stone with wedges, hammers and chisels, pecking away the tuff until an inner edifice appeared. Channels were carved for drainage. Steps hewn into the rock led from one chapel to another. Narrow tunnels connect courtyards so that a procession can move through a sealed world of rock and ritual. The technique demands patience measured in generations. Every strike requires judgment. Remove too much, and the shape is ruined. Remove too little, and the project stalls. The result reads like a city excavated from the inside out, a subterranean hymn in basalt and prayer. Daily life in Lalibela is folded into liturgy. The soundscape is dominated by choral singing in ge'ez, the liturgical language, layered with the beat of small drums, the rustle of cassock hems, and the metallic ping of bells. Monks and priests move with practiced economy through the complex, their steps guided by centuries of prescribed movement. A door opened at a certain hour, an incense censer swung along prescribed lines, a tabot, a sacred replica of the Ark of the Covenant, covered and reverently transported on particular feast days. The tabot is central, the presence that makes a building a church in the Ethiopian tradition, wrapped in cloth and attendant with ritual secrecy. Pilgrims come on foot from valleys and highlands, carrying offerings, grain, coffee, small crosses, leaving them in the stone niches intended for receiving gifts. Conservation here is both technical and theological. The stone is relatively soft when first cut, which made carving possible, but over centuries exposure to wind and rain plus human traffic have eroded details. Maintenance means tending to stone faces, repointing fissures with compatible mortar, and managing the flow of visitors so that prayer remains primary. Inside, Soot from lamps darkens surfaces. Conservators must balance the need for cleanliness with respect for ritual practice. Local custodians guard techniques, which oils are acceptable for lamps, how to repair a threshold without desecrating an altar, when a restoration requires the approval of ecclesiastical authorities. That dialogue between care and reverence is as much part of the site's survival as the original chisels. Threat comes not only from time, but from human interruption. Increased visitation brings helpful funds and dangerous wear. Pilgrimage is a living tradition. Tourism is often a livelihood. The two can coexist, but they can also clash. An unregulated camera flash can be an affront. A tourist path worn across ancient stone can accelerate decay. Souvenir stalls near the outer courts can commercialize ritual. Political instability in the region has, at times, put the churches at risk, whether from neglect, damage during conflict, or from the disruption of custodial traditions when communities are displaced. Climate shifts that alter rainfall patterns also matter. More intense seasonal storms can change how water runs through carved channels, washing away mortar or undermining steps. Yet devotion has remarkable persistence. Priests and lay custodians teach the younger generation the grammar of the site, how to sweep a courtyard in a way that honors its ritual alignment, how to mend a door without changing its proportions, how to read the chipped relief of a saint and restore it in the idiom of the original hand. Processions are not simply for show, they are the living mechanism that keeps thresholds active and tabots protected. The churches are not museums, they are houses of prayer that require the full-time attention of people who believe these carvings are part of a covenant. There are everyday objects here that carry weight beyond their utility. A small wooden ladder used to reach a high shelf is smoothed by generations of hands. A copper basin for washing hands holds mineral stains that tell the story of thousands of uses. The oil lamp lugs a specific scent of beeswax and resin that has come to be associated with safe sanctity. Food is simple and offering-driven. Communal meals after fasts, small loaves distributed to pilgrims, coffee brought low and fragrant as a sign of hospitality. In each object and ritual, continuity is a technique, an arrangement of daily acts that keeps the sacred space alive. What is at stake, then, is not just stone, but the ecology of practice. If custodians grow few, if pilgrimage wanes or becomes purely recreational, the church's survival becomes a conservation problem rather than a living cultural continuity. The drama here is not of imminent collapse, but of slow unraveling, rituals deferred, songs unlearned, a younger generation that sees bread and wages in distant towns rather than steps of a chiseled stair. Conservation efforts must therefore work alongside communities, amplifying local stewardship rather than imposing outside museum standards that could strip the place of its living function. Mini ganchos. The rock speaks in weathered words, but there is another kind of suspension, one that is literal. Move now from the enclosed carved hollows of Lalibela to the open vertigo of Meteora, where the world below opens like a throat and people once made themselves unreachable by living atop columns of stone. Chapter 5. Meteora, Greece. Monasteries hoisted above the world. There is a particular vertigo to Meteora. Standing at the lip of a stone pillar, the ground seems an insultingly distant thing. Pillars rise like organ pipes from a plateau, sheer columns of sandstone and conglomerate whose tops are flattened, crowned by hermitages and austere monastic cells. For centuries, these monasteries were reachable only by ladder, by rope, by nets and winches, methods that made entry selective, slow, and deliberate. To be hoisted in a basket was to be admitted not merely into a monastery, but into a guarded way of life, measured by hunger, weather, and prayer. Approach a Meteora pillar at dawn, and you hear a wind that wraps itself around rock, a sound like silk sliding over stone. The first impression is of incredible isolation. Tiny windows, narrow terraces, a single path cut into impossible angles. Monastic life up there is organized around essentials. Water collected in cisterns and channeled through narrow pipes, food stored carefully in cellars carved into rock, and a careful rationing schedule that maps weeks of supply against the likelihood of storms. Historically, ascent and descent were acts of both necessity and ritual. Winches and ropes, diameters and mechanisms that varied over time and from community to community, were used to lift goods and, at times, people. Nets that could hold a person were hoisted by teams. Those suspended in them experienced a literal crossing from world to monastery, an elevation of body that mimicked an elevation of spirit. Inside the monastic cells, the sensory palette changes. Frescoes, painted scenes of Christ, saints and liturgical cycles, line small chapels. The pigments, often mineral-based, have soaked into the stone and held color where sunlight has been kept at bay. Echoes and chant create an acoustic that makes a single voice multiply into a choir. Simple utensils and modest furnishings speak to a minimalism chosen for ascetic reasons. A plain bed, a wooden lectern with a well-thumbed Bible, a small table scarred by centuries of communal meals. Food is baked in small quantities, breads, preserved olives, beans, and occasionally salted fish brought up by trustworthy hands. Water is both treasure and constraint. Cisterns are cleaned and sealed carefully, and every drop is counted. The ascetic logic of Meteora is clear. Separation is devotion. Monks sought refuge from external interference, raids, political upheaval, and the demands of secular life by placing their homes above the reach of most practical ambition. The geography itself became a defense. Steep cliffs and narrow approaches deterred attackers, while the height enforced solitude and discipline. That solitude had a cost. Supply lines were precarious, communications with villages below were intermittent, and winters could trap a monastery in silence for long stretches. These were sacrifices made in a deliberate calculus, a life withdrawn to protect a way of praying. Modernity altered that calculus. Paths were cut, bridges built, and in many places stairs now climb where ropes once held sway. For many monasteries this has been a mixed blessing. Easier access brought pilgrims and the income that sustains conservation and upkeep. It also brought demands on space and distraction. Tourism flows can be overwhelming. The quiet that once shaped prayer is punctuated by camera shutters, guided groups, and souvenir stalls at the base of monasteries. Managers attempt mitigation, restricted visiting hours, fenced-off monastic areas, and interpretive signage. But the tension between open access and cloistered life is structural. The maintenance of Meteora's monasteries is a complex chore. Professionals and monastic lay-workers monitor rock stability, channel water away from vulnerable joints, and repair joints where centuries have loosened stone bolts. Wooden balconies and ladders need constant attention in a climate that cycles between hot, dry summers and wet, erosive seasons. Frescoes require conservators who understand both pigment and the porous substrate. Simple tasks like sealing a roof must respect not only structural integrity, but also the aesthetic and liturgical character of the place. The balance between preserving material fabric and preserving lived practice is again central. A well-restored fresco is meaningless if the prayer it depicts is no longer performed. There are stories of ingenuity around everyday needs. One monastic house, for example, optimized rainwater capture through a system of channels leading to underground cisterns carved into soft rock. They add a filtration bed of sand and charcoal that improves clarity and reduces odors. In other places, pulley systems once used to haul sacks of grain have been converted for safety, fitted with modern brakes that keep the historical feel without risking human lives. Such adaptations illustrate how continuity can be creative. Preservation is not always returning to an original state, but finding ways for old techniques to coexist with modern safety. Tourism, again, is double-edged. Pilgrims come with devotion. Tourists often come with curiosity and appetite. Infrastructure, parking lots, visitor centers, snack kiosks, grows at the monastery's feet. Local economies benefit, but the risk is that a place of withdrawal will become a stage. Some communities have chosen to limit opening hours, to require respectful clothing and behavior, and to put a portion of entry fees toward active conservation and local social programs. Others struggle with competing priorities, the immediate need for income versus the slow, persistent work of preserving remote heritage. Climax and mirror. Meteora as metaphor. Meteora is a culminating image in this journey because its suspension is literal and symbolic. The monasteries hanging on pillars of stone embody a human strategy, being apart to remain intact. That strategy is echoed in other chapters. Uros floating on totora to avoid assimilation, terrace people clinging to steep slopes to preserve a way of life, high desert communities maintaining micro-environments to survive and to keep their stories alive. In each case, suspension is refusal, a refusal to be absorbed, to be leveled by centripetal forces that erode language, ritual, and habit. But suspension is not neutral. It costs. It demands labor, ritual, and sometimes a life of scarcity. It can protect identity, yes, but it can also reproduce isolation that makes adaptation difficult. The question that echoes from summit to lake to carved church is not merely romantic. What will our society sustain when balance requires constant, strenuous keeping? And who pays when young people decide the cost is too high? Conclusion. Return to the question. We began with an image, a home without ground beneath it. Now we have seen the practices that transform impossible places into inhabitable ones. We have watched reeds become islands and islands become villages. We have watched terraces stitched into slope and irrigation carved like script into stone. We have seen labor turn a desert valley into a place that yields barley and kinship. We have stood in rock-cut churches where prayer is the primary mason, and we have felt the vertigo of monasteries that literally lifted lives above the plain. What ties these stories together is not just geography but an ethic. The idea that home is an act of maintenance, a daily agreement between people and place. For some, that agreement is pragmatic. Repair reeds weekly so the village stays afloat. For others, it is devotional. Carve a sanctuary out of stone and guard the tablet with your life. For others still, it is a social compact. Share water, labor, and knowledge so that the community survives as a woven thing. Threats are both immediate and long-term. Tourism brings money and pressure. Pollution poisons the lake and undermines reed beds. Climate change shifts water regimes and melts glaciers that are lifelines. Migration moves youth away from craft and memory. Political choices, where to build a road, how to regulate access, whether to support local education in place or encourage migration, alter the calculus. Preservation, then, is not a single technical problem, but an ethical and economic one. It requires partnerships between custodians and conservators, between local traditions and supporting institutions, and between visitors and hosts. There are practical steps that communities and outsiders can take together. Support for local stewardship, training younger custodians in traditional techniques, subsidizing school programs that teach place-based crafts, and funding conservation that respects ritual can make a tangible difference. Tourism can be managed to benefit locals. Community-run visitor programs, limits on numbers during sensitive rituals, fees that go directly to maintenance. Environmental protection of watersheds and glaciers, when politically viable, safeguards the hydrological systems these communities depend on. Yet none of these measures is simple. Each involves trade-offs and negotiations, where the people who live there must be primary decision-makers. So what would you give up to keep who you are? It is not a theoretical question for the people we met. It is lived out in weekly reed mending, in the lifelong apprenticeship of a terrace mason, in the careful conservation of a tabot, in the willingness to be hauled up in a net as admission into a cloistered life. Choices are heavy, often invisible to outsiders. They involve bargaining with weather and market, with memory and ambition. If one last image will stay with you, imagine a hand, calloused, stained with smoke or with stone dust, reaching into the work of the day. That hand is a reconciliation between person and place, a deliberate act that keeps a house from disappearing, a ritual from being forgotten, a community from dissolving. Preservation is not merely the work of institutions or tourists. It is the hands and songs and small economies of people who decide again and again to remain. Editor note: verify the number 11 for Lalibela churches and confirm historical descriptions attributed to King Lalibela. Confirm phrasing around meteora, ascent methods, nets and winches, and local names, spellings for Kalaka and Drogba, before final cut. Final invitation. Which of these places surprised you most? Which home made you rethink what comfort or safety looks like? Share in the comments which chapter moved you and why. The reed sway of Lake Titicaca, the precarious terraces of Bumbaray, the wind-scorched ingenuity of the high desert, the carved sanctuaries of Lalibela, or the suspended monasteries of Meteora. If this journey called to you, follow the channel for more stories that look beyond the map and into how people choose to live. Home isn't where you're comfortable, it's where you decide to stay.